And right in that moment I was taking that photo, mom was over at her house, a small modular home right beside me, that she was on the phone call with our Christian insurance about that second surgery. And after each phone call, they would always ask at the Christian insurance, would you like to be prayed for? Or do you have anybody that you want prayer for? Well, mama would always mention me. Can you please pray for Abby? And on that phone call, that insurance lady, she said to my mom, have you heard of Andrew Wommack?
Hey, everybody, it's me, Julieann Hartman with The Journey, and I have with me today Abby McNeal, which is going to be an incredible story because it's kind of crazy how we met. I'm at Healing is Here, and Abby and her mom and dad just happened to catch me in the lobby and said, we have a testimony that I think you would love to hear. And so here we are. See, your parents are still, uh, bringing you into situations like when we were kids, right? It's like, no, go do it, go do it, go do it. So I'm so glad that they actually did catch me on that. So, Abby, thank you so much for coming and joining us and telling your story to the whole world.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure meeting you. And up front, I had met your husband first, and he said, you need to meet my wife. And so we came out and were able to find you and meet some more of your team. And it's just been wonderful. I'm so glad that it worked out today.
Yes. Okay. So, with your accent, you're obviously from the South.
Yes, that's right. I'm from South Georgia, about 2 hours from Savannah. And now I live in North Georgia, about 6 hours from there.
Okay. So now I want to go over just a little bit of your childhood because I don't know anything about you. And obviously, there was a sickness and you've been healed from it. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But so, what was your upbringing like? Were you raised a Christian? Give us a little bit of the insight of what your house was like.
Yeah, I love to. That's always the foundation. And
Yeah.
so I always remember knowing the Lord, having a personal relationship with God. And I'd say that my home also fostered that relationship with God. You see, my parents, they were in ministry. My mom was a full-time volunteer, and whatever ever the need was, she would fill. And so nursery, kids church, whenever my sister and I were older, she moved up to youth and she did different plays and dramas. And then my dad was on church council and helped mama as well, and outside of his IT business that he used for ministry. And so that foundation was definitely a huge help to me. I loved it because church was my second home. I had my sleeping mat there, my movies, the snacks, they're all ready for me because I was there sometimes more than I was even at my house. And I loved it. I loved seeing that part of ministry. I loved seeing my parents just yield to the Spirit and go wherever God told them to go. It helped me to be prepared for whenever God closes one door and tells you to go, that you go and you see that God's opened more doors for you. And you just continue to be faithful in whatever He leads. And you can be a blessing wherever you go. And that's what I saw with them. But God was so real to me. He was more real than anything. I always remember just being so drawn to him from as early as I can even remember, praying to him, singing to him, feeling conviction of sin, wanting to live as close to God as possible. And I even have letters from whenever I could barely even write. And I was writing him songs, worship songs. And he was just my everything. And that was the foundation that saw me through. If I did not have that relationship with God, I don't believe I would be here today at all. And thankfully, my parents also had that personal relationship with God because they needed to hear his voice in leading me. Because whenever I was 13 was whenever I became sick.
Mhm. Okay. So, do you have siblings?
I do. I have one sister. She's older by 3 years. And then she's given me a brother in law and a 7-year-old nephew, a 3-year-old niece.
Oh, that's so sweet. Okay, so there was no, because a lot of times there's like there was no God or just really bad doctrine, like being in a cult, whatever. Usually that's kind of like the background, and then the sickness comes, right? And that kind of exposes everything. So you're saying that everything was great and fine and perfect, and then you said at age you said 13?
Yes.
Okay. So what started happening? What were your symptoms? What was life like before that even happened?
Oh, life was amazing right before that. I was growing all the more closer to God. My parents were full-time youth pastors at that point, and it was the most amazing time. And then God led them to actually step down from ministry for the first time in my entire life. And we realized then why that was because they needed to become my caretakers quickly after. And so it was my best time. I was the healthiest I had ever been. I was trying out for the cheer team that year. I was the happiest I'd ever been and just closer to God. And it was wonderful. And then all of a sudden, the pivotal moment that I remember was first, I had skin rashes. I thought, well, I'm in the grass for cheer. It must be something to do with that. So the doctor said, just put on this ointment and it will be better. And then I started having colds after colds that would just never fully go away. And then the really pivotal moment that sticks in my mind vividly was I was getting ready for church one Sunday morning and my mom was painting my fingernails. And all of a sudden, vision went black and I was fixing to pass out. And so she led me to sit down. And that was the moment that then soon after symptom came on and unusual symptoms until I had about 50 different symptoms all at one time. But at first, it was really like colds, fever, congestion, dizziness, unable to think of words. It was just everything all at once. And then it just continued to spiral more and more till I was starting my eighth grade school year. And I could only attend 3 days into it until I had to become homebound.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So what's happening now in the house at that point where I'm sure everybody is shocked and surprised and emotional too because they're watching their daughter, not being able to function or pass out or whatever. So what was going on in the house?
Yes. It was I'm thankful my parents, they were the rock and the Lord was their rock, and so that was the blessing in it. So mom was just seeking direction of, "Lord, what is this that's going on?" Because for me, it looked like Parkinson's, lupus, Tourette's, Alzheimer's, dyslexia, Crohn's disease, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue, a form of tachycardia, all at one time. And then finally, we came to realize that what was causing those symptoms of those diseases on multiple levels was Lyme disease and co-infections, which caused around those 50 cents that could happen all at one time and mimics those diseases mentioned, plus many others. Whenever mom finally came across Lyme disease, she printed out a thing of all the symptoms and she was able to highlight almost every single symptom on that list. So we knew that God had led her to what it was. But with doctors, there's not much help at all. And so we had a blood test done and it didn't show much of anything. And then proceeded further on into dad bringing me all the way to different doctor's visits as well. And until I was put onto a team of 5 doctors at a hospital in Savannah. And they ran as many tests as they could. There's PICC lines, IV infusions, a surgery placing a portacast device in my chest. There were 2 spinal taps, and the last one the pain medication did not take effect, but of course I had to stay extremely still or else. And all that whenever I was 13, 14 years old. So thankfully, my parents, they were the solid rock. Dad was our provider and a spiritual provider, and he was a help to my mom because she was having to be my full time caretaker while he went and provided financially for us.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So all those diseases that you mentioned, those were all like spoken over you, like these are the things that you could have right now?
They didn't much know, the doctors. They did all the tests to rule out every disease known to man as well as those diseases. But as far as my symptom list went, it very much looked like those diseases and could very well have been misdiagnosed for Parkinson's. And with a lot of Lyme patients, they are misdiagnosed for a lot of those common diseases that were mentioned and many others, just because the list goes on and on. And with Lyme, if you're bitten, and we don't know for sure if I was bitten with a tick or not, that is the most common way to contract it. But I know also that I was eventually led to my Lyme doctor by a man who got bit on the ear by a mosquito and contracted Lyme. And oftentimes, if you're bitten with a diseased insect, you're not only injected with Lyme organisms, but several co-infection ones as well. And so those organisms then move out in the bloodstream. They burrow into organs, muscles, tissues. They try to settle in. They decide which part of your body to attack on any given day. That's why there's an array of symptoms hard to diagnose, and the ultimate outcome can either be irreversible damage or, worst case, even death. But while your immune system fights, doing so attacks your body. Any organism left behind waits patiently until the coast is clear to continue to destroy and wreak havoc. So that left my parents with having to make decisions whether to let the organisms destroy me or the side effects of the Lyme treatments. And so it was just a continual war and a battle that was hard to live through, and even harder for doctors and people to believe. The doctors had to run so many tests on me that I felt like a test rat, and they looked at me that way, just puzzled as to what I actually had, because some doctors would say that Lyme does not exist except for in the northern states, not in the south. So they just outright refused to treat me. And they're so tied up with what they could even treat me with. So thankfully, because of God leading, after I hadn't been on that team of doctors at the hospital, I was eventually um, given high doses of antibiotics through a portacath device in my chest. And my mom always had to administer that antibiotics to me every day. And for 6 weeks, we were given. And every single time, whenever she would go to flush the blood through the portacath, each time she could have killed me, she was very much holding my life in her hands. And so that was a very real reality of just that. Can you imagine your 13, 14-year-old daughter going through that? And so thankfully, dad was her rock in that season as well.
My gosh. So what was daily life for you back then?
Yeah, daily life was very difficult. It was hard to perform simple tasks at every shower. And when I went from lying down to standing up or sitting down to standing up, each time I'd try to pass out. And so that was always a difficulty. I had difficulty thinking of words. I knew what I wanted to say, but I couldn't say it. All of a sudden, developed dyslexia. I had never had that before. And so there were different rashes, heat fluctuation, autoimmune tissue and joint issues, visual disturbances, and so many more symptoms. So it affected every single day. For 7 years, I was homebound through that. I could barely get out. I was basically bedridden off and on. And some would say with Lyme, there comes an eventual remission where the Lyme organisms lie dormant and the symptoms thereof as well. But in my case, I can tell you that I never experienced that. Instead, I had a few symptoms that lessened whenever I was 15 right after treatment, but then it returned quickly, uh, just in a nightmare of a cycle. And then at 17, I had some symptoms lessen, only to return quickly, along with addition of endometriosis that then battled alongside that. So it was just every day and very difficult to function for doctors and people to understand what I was going through. There were lots of mindless stares and comments, and hours upon hours of life passed me by while my peers went on with their lives. My sleep was horrific. I had so many jerks, tremors, spasms, including facial spasms. And due to the severity of those facial spasms, I even endured scabs inside my mouth from the constant movements. And my sleep was a nightmare because of the never ending pain. I remember especially early on, the severity of the pain, 10 out of 10. I have a high pain tolerance. The only relief was screaming into my pillow, crying out to the Lord. That was it. Pain medications did nothing for me. And in fact, I ended up being allergic to some. And so, anyway, it was just constant and a never ending nightmare for all those years. And it just continued to spiral and get worse and worse. And by the end, we had tried everything for me to get better. Near the 7th year mark, I had moved out and I just was then developing the endometriosis. And we moved me into a small mobile home right beside my parents' home where it could be dark, cold, quiet because my sensory systems were in such disarray. It was very difficult to be out in the world because smells, taste, temperatures, sounds, and lights were extremely painful and made my symptoms flare up all the more. So they moved me into this mobile home right beside them so I could keep it as cold, as quiet, as dark as possible to try to help me get better. And yet, at that point in time, about 6 years in, I honestly thought I was going to die. It was looking like the very start of the sickness before I had received any treatment. I even had these marks to come up on my arm that I had not had since the very start of the sickness, and it was a co-infection of Lyme that was fixing to mean that the sickness was fixing to get even worse. And that was like, no, no, that can't happen. So then at that time, the endometriosis, on top of everything else, was developing. And so I had my first surgery and moved back in with my parents to have that surgery. And then we tried one more time to basically come to all the things that we could try to help me to become better. They decided to sell their childhood home, my childhood home, their larger home, and downsize and build me a healing house, is what we called it. It was a metal building with a house inside of it that was well insulated, as dark, as cold, as quiet as possible, only 2 to 4 windows, the entire thing, so that I could be in an atmosphere that we hoped that I could thrive more in. And so at that time, I knew that I needed a second endometriosis surgery because the first one just left me in worse case than I was before. And I wanted to refuse at that point the Lyme. I was the type of person during the disease where I basically just hid a lot of my sickness. I decided not to fully embrace it and kind of just try to imagine. I know that God is going to fully heal me, so I know this is not my reality. So a lot of times I just didn't acknowledge a lot of the disease, and at that point I had stopped going to Lyme doctors after age 16, and now that was 18, 19 years old. And so I just knew, one day I'm going to be completely healed. Mom says early on that I told her at like 13 years old, Mama, God told me I'm going to live and not die and declare the works of the Lord. And so that was my belief that whole time. I'm waiting on God. I'm waiting on this miracle. I'm going to be completely healed. And so whenever we moved me into that healing house, I had my second surgery, and just within those 4 months of the first, the webbing of the endometriosis had gotten so bad that it was beginning to cut off the proper function of my lower intestines. It was combining my ovary to my lower intestines with this webbing of disease in only those 4 months. And so I knew that if we had not gotten that surgery whenever I did, that who knows, I would probably lost function of that part of my lower abdomen. And so I'm just thankful to the Lord for his timing in that. And so what was so interesting is this healing house actually became my healing house. And right after that second surgery, there was one day, and this is the beginning of the healing testimony, where basically Mama had walked through my house and I was at the worst of the worst. It was the most seemingly hopeless season at that point because I had stopped going to Lyme doctors. They couldn't offer me a cure. And I knew that my healing could only come through God. So I was waiting and I was distracting from the severity of the pain. If I could have been in the hospital every single day at that point, I would have been. But nobody could offer me any help. And so I just distracted and waited for that miracle, is what I thought, because I had never heard the full gospel before. But then Mama walks in one day. She tries to barely touch my recliner chair, which was my everything. I was in the recliner every day, all day long. And she came in, I was in so much nausea, pain. Headaches were so severe, I couldn't even carry on a conversation. I couldn't even text people for those last couple of years. And so she came in and she was going to touch just my chair. And I urged with pain. I said, no, no, Mama, don't touch, because I knew it was going to make my pain even worse, just touching my chair, barely moving it. And so after that moment, I could tell that she was upset by the reality of my condition. And she had those moments where it didn't show. But at that point, it also led me to get to the point where I was just sick and tired of being sick and tired for so long. And the issue was I could never fully get to that point before, because a lot of the doctrine that we were raised in within our local churches, alongside TV, mainstream Christian media, is that a lot of mystery. Well, maybe it's not always God's will to heal, or maybe it is God's will in his timing. So just wait in the meantime. Maybe God's letting you go through this, that along the way. And in doctor's visits, you can reach someone you wouldn't have otherwise, which in my case made no sense because I couldn't much communicate with them or get out. And so anyway, there are all those like mysteries around healing. And whenever they said to me, well, if it's the Lord's will, then you'll be healed. But my body still remained so sick. The only simple conclusion would be, well, it's not currently his will. So how could I fight against his will? So it just kept me bound. And now I tell people the truth because that is the doctrine that kept me bound. And so, anyway, after she had left my house that one day, trying to touch my recliner, she was clearly upset by the reality. I got upset by the reality of my condition. And I even took a photo in faith of that ailment of co-infection, that visible mark that had not been on my body since the very start of the sickness when I was so deathly ill. And I took the photo in faith I would have the evidence whenever that symptom, that mark left my body, rather than in the natural, meaning that the sickness was fixing to get even worse. And I refused that outcome because I had stopped going to doctors, because there was no more further hope or cure for me. I couldn't get worse. I was very much headed to the state where it was either irreversible damage or death. And so I just refused that outcome. I took that photo. I said, I'm going to have the evidence whenever this leaves. And right in that moment I was taking that photo, mom was over at her house, a small modular home right beside me, that she was on the phone call with our Christian insurance about that second surgery. And after each phone call, they would always ask at the Christian insurance, would you like to be prayed for? Or do you have anybody that you want prayer for? Well, mama would always mention me. Can you please pray for Abby? Well, at that point was the point that everything changed. I was over there at my house taking that photo, being done with the sickness. But if this didn't transpire, if this full gospel didn't come our way, I don't know that that would produce much because we needed the truth in our life. And on that phone call, that insurance lady, she said to my mom, have you heard of Andrew Wommack? And I believe that she said that many of the patients have seen a lot of help with his teachings, like a lot of improvement. Well, we had never heard of Andrew Wommack before. Amazingly, I don't know how. And so, anyway, my mama jotted down that website, and I was over at my house taking that picture. So I meet her outside, and I was at that point just excited, like, I'm going to have the evidence whenever this symptom goes. Well, then mama, she asked me, she's like, Abby, how do you pray? And I was like, why are you asking this sort of thing? Because she knows that how I pray is always how we were kind of taught to pray, always how we heard how to pray, but just kind of along the extent of, God, I just ask that you bring forward this full healing in my body, if it's your will. And that sort of type of prayer. It was always asking God, it was always begging God. And she said, Abby, we have been taking it back with our words. We have been taking it back with our prayers. And she said that we've just been begging God. And she said, Abby, you've got to listen to this. So she gave me the Andrew Wommack website. And I got onto the same sermon that she had watched alongside the Healing Journeys videos as well. But this particular teaching was about Andrew went to a lady's house who had a magnet, a coat of magnets, or a jacket of magnets, and she wore that to help her never ending pain. And Andrew taught her this way to pray that was modeled after the Lord's Prayer. First, you rise up in faith and praise, and that's where I'd include healing scriptures I had said for all those 7 years. But then the piece I was missing came right after because in the middle of the prayer, you rebuke the symptoms one by one, naming them and telling them that they have to flee in Jesus' name. Then you end the prayer of thanksgiving to God, knowing that He has provided our every need through the sacrifice and resurrection of Jesus. And that was the first time where I began to see symptom after symptom truly start to go. And I was amazed how simple it was. I mean, if ever someone tried to come back, you just repeat that process. Praise, rebuke the symptoms using Jesus' name, then praise God again. And I actually saw my symptoms start to go for the first time. It was astounding to me. And to hear the full gospel for the first time, that was in March of 21, it healed my heart to realize I knew that God was good. I knew He was a good, good Father, but I didn't know because of the doctrine that was mixed in, I thought possibly He could be the one keeping me stuck in that way. And so there's a root of bitterness that had come in that I didn't even realize because I love the Lord with all my heart. I always wanted to serve Him. But I was believing because of the doctrine, He's the one keeping me sick in a way because we were taught very much sovereignty doctrine, like lots of mainstream Christian media does. God controls everything, all things, anything that's happening in your life, that's because of Him. And it was so wrong. And at that point in time, I have been very mindful of like what I spoke over me, but we're also taught another thing of like if you don't speak out the disease, then maybe the devil can't hear you about it and doesn't know what's going on. And I didn't realize at that point he was the one putting all that on me. He used natural means, but it was still his causing. And so to hear the full gospel meant that I could finally take a stand against that sickness. And the Spirit had already stirred that boldness in me, and now He was providing the truth and the means to do so. Because without hearing that Jesus had already provided for it, I couldn't have taken that stand.
Wow. Well, we're actually out of time already. That's how fast it went. My gosh,
Oh, wow.
I have so many questions. So we're going to get to those questions on the next episode. So thank you so much, Abby, for joining us today on this on the journey. And we'll come back next week and finish this up. But I also want to please remind you to share these videos. This is an incredible story. I mean, this girl was in a bed. I mean, we've heard this story many times. Some are even more severe than what you've experienced, but God has completely healed you. Wow, that is awesome. So share these stories because there are a lot of people out there that are suffering with these exact symptoms. And it would just imagine that you sharing this story and that person that you don't even know gets a hold of it somehow. And now there's just this domino effect of people getting healed of these crazy diseases. Well, that's what it takes, right?
Yeah.
And just to know that you just were just believing the wrong thing, that's all. Or not just the wrong thing, you believed in God, but the way you met him was different.
Hmm.
So I thank you so much, Abby. So share the videos, everyone, and make sure that you come back and join us. Go to healingjourneystoday.com and find out everything that we're doing. You need to subscribe to our newsletter so you can find out exactly what's happening at Healing Journeys Today. We've got so many great things like this journey, and we have guest teachers that are just amazing, and I know you'd love it. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time on the journey.